an in-depth interview with the President of Sierra Leone. And what is the UN doing to eradicate AIDS? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Julius Maada of Sierra Leone is one of many leaders from around the world to address the United Nations General Assembly in New York. I sat down with him to discuss some of the major issues and challenges facing his country, and we also talked about Sierra Leone's strong relationship with China. Later in the program, we will hear too from Winnie Byanyima. She is the Executive Director of UNAIDS and is leading the United Nations effort to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. But we begin with President Julius Maada. Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us. One of the goals at this year's UN General Assembly is rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. A lofty goal, a very ambitious goal. How can Sierra Leone contribute to peace and security around the world?
I believe that we have a major contribution. We've had the bitter lesson of going through an 11-year civil war. And during that time, we learned quite a lot. We were able to settle after 11 years with a negotiated settlement. So a lot of destruction, a lot of bitterness, a lot of division, a lot of destruction, but at the end, we finished on the table. What this says to me is that war is not good. It is only going to increase strife for people. It is going to divide our societies. It is going to affect development. It is going to affect how we view one another. And in a global village, as we have today, I think we should be able to sit down, discuss, and through dialogue, resolve these issues. The atrocities, the destruction, the bitterness, the wanton destruction that goes with war are just unacceptable in today's world. I think we are far more advanced today to be able to sit around the table, discuss the differences we have, resolve them, find a way to resolve them. So that takes me to the General Assembly and the other international bodies. I think they should be such that everybody should be heard. Even the least countries, whatever standard of measurement is taken, should have a voice around the table. That way, it will instill confidence and trust. We will have a lot of trust in these international bodies. We know that we can have our day there if there is need for that. And we will also give it all the support that it requires to be able to deal with much more complex issues. So we in Africa are fighting for 3 places at the UN Security Council in the permanent category. 2 places, seats, but it's been extremely difficult. And unfortunately, 70% of the issues discussed at the UN Security Council are about Africa. So we are saying that if it is about Africa, we should be there to make our voices heard. That has fallen on deaf ears so far. But I am the chair, the coordinator for the Committee of 10, and we have a common African position. We are going to push for that. It may sound difficult, but we will never stop because we are talking about 1.2 billion people, and most of the decisions taken at the United Nations Security Council are about Africa. We should be seated there.
Right, of course, there are many people who have also expressed the call for reform of the United Nations, especially the Security Council, including the Secretary General himself. Are you hopeful that there will be some kind of reform?
There has to be. I'm very hopeful. We are going to make sure it happens. We are going to keep talking about it. We are going to keep pricking their conscience. If you're talking about a democratic world, it should not just stop at the national level, it should be at the international level. So I'm very optimistic. It may take a long time, but we are determined to push as hard as possible.
Let's talk about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's one of the most challenging and ambitious undertakings by the United Nations. It's something that you're very passionate about because in last year's address to the UN General Assembly, you talked about the importance of education. You talked about the importance of gender equality. But there are challenges, of course. We are facing a climate crisis right now. We are facing food insecurity. And of course, many countries around the world are still trying to emerge from the pandemic. What does Sierra Leone bring to achieving those Sustainable Development Goals?
As you've rightly characterized the situation, I think these are lofty goals, and we hope we are not going to aspire to these goals, that we are going to take concrete action at the state and the international levels to make sure that we achieve them. But of course, we've been confronted with new emerging and evolving challenges. Of course, we have gone through COVID, but the lingering effects still are with us. We now have multiple crises, of course, Ukraine and so many other things, and then climate action we must undertake now. These are distractions. I think what we have done in Sierra Leone, let's say for instance, education, which we think it's so important for the human being in the 21st century. In the face of all of these distractions and pressures and crises, we have kept a steady progress as far as education is concerned. We committed ourselves to it. We have, before I came into leadership, there was no access for a lot of people. Now we have declared free access for everybody so that every child in Sierra Leone goes to school. And when we say every child, we have even adopted a policy called radical inclusion. Irrespective of where you are, who you are, political persuasions, or what, we have removed all barriers to make sure. This was done during COVID. And even when COVID was at its peak, we made sure that we kept on the schools. We improvised, and we also custom-made our own lockdowns to make sure that we did not disrupt schools. Examinations, transition examinations took place. So I think commitment at the national level should be matched with commitment at the international level. The big polluters, for instance, let's say for climate change, must commit genuinely to changing their ways or to helping also us get access to the finances that we need to do the transition, the energy transition that we need to. Quite a lot is at stake, and I think it takes more than just grand declarations and commitments at all of these meetings, but really genuine commitment to changing the fate of this world in which we live today.
Right. As you point out, the big polluters have made commitments. I mean, they promised $100 billion just a few years ago as part of the effort to combat climate change, but that hasn't materialized.
I've not seen a cent of that. And this is what I'm saying, that it's not just the declarations, it's actually about making sure that we are among the 20 most vulnerable nations to the effects of climate change. We have rainforests, and we need our people to preserve that. But they also live in those forests, and they need livelihoods. If we cannot provide alternative livelihoods for these people, they are going to definitely fall on their environment for wood, for other things. And this is how we are losing the green cover very quickly. So we are saying we need some support. in terms of mitigation and adaptation, these are all things that don't go without the necessary capital. And we are struggling with economic development. Inflation is hitting hard in the wake of COVID-19, the crises, the multiple crises, and so many other things. So in this sort of situation, we definitely need support, and that is not forthcoming.
You talked a moment ago about some of the challenges that the world faces right now. You talked about the Ukraine conflict. It's impacting the entire globe. At the beginning of next year, Sierra Leone will take its seat at the UN Security Council. This is a non-permanent rotating seat. How important is this for Sierra Leone to make its voice heard at that forum? And what do you propose be done about tamping down the kinds of divisions that we see right now, the kinds of rising tensions that we see right now?
From the outside, I'm yet to take my seat at the UN Security Council. From the outside, we have our views. We know that conflicts do not help in any way. We describe the world as a global village, and therefore we are so intertwined. And I wasn't expecting that a war in Ukraine would affect my food supply, but that is the reality today. So now that we know we live in a global village, I think we should develop a consensus around dialogue. Wars are destructive. Wars don't solve problems. We have gone through 11 years of civil war. At the end, we had to go to the negotiating table after a lot of destruction. That experience informs my own perspective as far as wars are concerned. However strategic, however important it is for us to maybe preserve our national security agenda, I think we should exhaust all peaceful remedies, using the international community, using the bodies that exist, using, backdoor diplomacy and anything. War is destructive, and the impact of wars will last much longer than the war itself. And I don't think we need that in the modern day.
Let's move on to your relationship with China. It is your biggest trading partner. How has this relationship evolved, and how has trade and, of course, people-to-people exchanges impacted the nature of the relationship?
Well, we have enjoyed a great bilateral relationship with the People's Republic of China, and quite a lot is taking place in terms of projects, in terms of people's relationship, in terms of trade, culture, education, and so on and so forth. They have been a reliable partner. They have been the most reliable, one of the most reliable partners that we've had, where they have seen the need for development. They have come in. Where they have promised, they have delivered. They've treated us with respect, there's mutual respect between our two countries and people. A lot of training, especially when I took on education as the flagship, a lot of training is going on between the people of Sierra Leone and in China in particular. So it's a great relationship. We do get our challenges here and there, but that is very natural with relationships. But on the whole, we have had a great relationship.
China will soon be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's one of the biggest projects in the world, infrastructure projects. It's China's signature outreach to the developing world. More than 150 projects have been completed. There's been investment of something like $1 trillion. What has the Belt and Road Initiative done for Sierra Leone? You became part of that initiative in 2018.
We have had quite a lot of projects completed, undertaken and completed, some of them within a year or two. I can talk about bridges, I can talk about roads, I can talk about, there are quite a lot. Like I said earlier, whenever China has promised, they have not attached strings. Once they see the need, and they will come in. And as I speak, we had a major bridge collapse, and they have promised, and they have gone there. They've done the studies. They are going to help to fix that, and there are quite a lot than I can remember now. But I must say that in any instance, in all the instances where they have seen the need, and said they are going to do something in terms of development, they have always come through.
Talking about bridges, there's a major engineering project which is underway. You were involved in that. You were there at the groundbreaking of the bridge that is being built by Power China over the Siwa River. What impact will that project have for Sierra Leone in terms of transportation, in terms of agricultural production?
For us, we still have a country that needs a lot of infrastructure, physical infrastructure development. And that is a drag on development if we do not take care of these, because they are separating communities. And in the rains, when it rains really heavily, schools, kids are not able to go across to go to school. Different communities are not able to access, let's say, if the health center is on the other side or one side of the river, it becomes extremely dangerous using dugout canoes to do that. So for us, it may sound little, but the bridges, the roads into the communities are extremely important. Basic infrastructure to not only for the services that we provide as a government to be accessed, but also for agriculture. We are an agrarian society, and we need to have access to market. Our people need access to market. Without the roads and the bridges, they are stuck with their goods. Livelihood becomes difficult for them. Economic progress is not made, and everybody gets to lose. So these are quite important for us.
You were talking a moment ago about climate change, and this, of course, is a global challenge. And Africa, particularly, has been very hard hit by the effects of climate change. I mean, if we look at some of the things that have happened, there have been thousands of people who have died in the flooding in Libya. East Africa has been suffering from drought. There's water scarcity. There's food security in many countries. What is Sierra Leone doing to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Well, we are committed to climate action, whatever we can do to mitigate and adapt to, well, mitigate first, because that is the most important thing, but also to adapt to climate change. What we have done is a commitment. We are involved in planting a lot of trees, that is to make sure that we have enough green cover that we have lost over the period. We are looking at the technical specifications of major infrastructure projects to make sure that they also help to mitigate against the effects. Especially, we live in a very difficult topography. The city is situated on the hills, below the hills. We had a major incident when we had a mudslide. Close to 1,000 people died in that. So how do we even develop our infrastructure so that incidents of that nature can be avoided? So that has become a major consideration in everything that we do. But of course, even with energy transition, now in most of our villages, we have what we call solar mini grids. Solar mini grids to provide energy for our far-to-reach communities who also need this for productive uses. But of course, we cannot link them up with on the grid. And so what we are doing is we are providing solar energy in these areas, and we have major potential for hydro. We want to see how we can invest in these so that we don't resort to dirty fuel energy. The green transition we take very seriously. What we are asking for is the support, because it's quite expensive. I mean, when you think about gas and the other things. So the transition we are committed to, but of course it takes a lot of money, and we are struggling with that. But we are fully committed.
Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We turn now to the United Nations effort to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. Leading the charge is the Executive Director of UNAIDS, Winnie Byanyima. My colleague, Elaine Reyes, talked with her in New York.
Ms. Byanyima, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You appeared recently here in New York at the Clinton Global Initiative, and you had a message, and it was a message of encouragement that if we can stay the course, that we can end HIV infections by 2030. For some, that may sound somewhat ambitious, but it is a very optimistic message. And so I want you to tell us, how did we get to this point, and why are you so encouraged?
You know, Elaine, 25 years ago, the world came together here at the United Nations and agreed. It was at the height of HIV, AIDS killing people. And they agreed as governments to come together and fight this together. They made a plan, they set targets, and every 5 years, they've met renewed targets, and here we are, 30 million people who are living with HIV are on treatment today and living good lives around the world. And that's the result of global solidarity. Rich countries put money down. Rich countries put money into companies to innovate and find the treatment. The treatment was costly at first. People living with HIV rose, fought hard, and companies were then pushed to share the technology. Generics were made. Now everyone, and prices came down, and everyone has what they need. We still have a way to go, though. 9 million people are still not on treatment. We're still pushing to get there. But why I was hopeful is that we're seeing some countries, and very poor countries, whom you would think cannot make that fast progress, making the progress. 5 countries have already achieved the targets that were set for 2025, 3 years early. A country like Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Botswana, these countries have already got to the midpoint. So it makes me hopeful that if those countries can, so can others. There are 16 other countries also with a high burden of HIV on the way to hitting those targets for 2025. So we know the path to end AIDS. We know what needs to be done. We just need the political will to, 1, keep the response financed. The countries with the biggest burden of HIV also happen to be among the poorest and with a high debt burden today. So we need to keep the resources going. We need to solve the debt problem so we can move the response. But 2, we need to empower communities to reach the last person. But we have some challenges today. We're seeing pushback on civil society. Space is becoming less and less, but they are the ones who know where to find the last person who needs prevention or treatment. We need rights, human rights. Around the world, we're seeing a pushback on women's rights, on the rights of LGBTQ people, on girls' rights. But without human rights, we cannot treat this disease away. People must have their agency, people must enjoy their human rights. Sex must not be violent, sexual violence has to be fought. So until we deliver on human rights, we have a blocker there. So we can get there, but we still have work to do to get there.
You just went through a lot there, and I want you to tell us more about some of the success stories you mentioned. But I want to ask you about that 9 million number. that you've been talking about. Who are the 9 million, and why is there such a challenge for those people to get treatment and to get the help they need?
Good question. That 9 million who need to be reached who are not reached are often those groups of people who are most despised in society, stigmatized, criminalized, and they are hiding from the benefits of the science that we have. Who are those? I mentioned LGBTQ people. These are gay men, men who have sex with men, and sex workers whose job exposes them to many sexual partners, but they too are stigmatized, criminalized in many countries. They fear to get out and go and get what they need. It's people who inject drugs. Personal use of drugs should not be criminalized, but it's criminalized in many countries. They too are hunted and don't come. They share needles and they pass the virus to each other. But they could have an environment where they don't have to get the disease because they have a drug. They shared. They wouldn't have to be infected if there was no criminalization and they could go and get whatever they need without fear. Then you also have girls and young women. Girls and young women are continuously being infected. You have children living with HIV whose mothers, for various reasons, don't bring forward to put on treatment. So it's often those groups of people, and when you think about whose children are these, they are poor, they are young women, they are probably even child mothers, girls who have had a baby, teenage pregnancy, and who don't have the agency to go forward and get what they need. So it's about human rights. It's mostly people who've been denied their rights, who are suffering some kinds of inequalities with others that are remaining. But we have to reach them by reducing those inequalities, ending those inequalities that put them away from services.
Has any progress been made when it comes to prevention and reaching the populations and regions that are fairly conservative, where there are cultural and religious stigmas around preventing HIV and AIDS?
Again, a good question. When you look from where we were at the height of infections, new infections, that was around 1995, and look at where we are today, new infections have been reduced by nearly 60%. Tremendous progress globally. But when you now unpack that and see where is the progress and where is the lack of progress, it's a bit scary, because you see that in some regions, new infections should be dropping, but instead are rising. We see new infections rising in the Middle East, the region, North Africa and the Middle East. We see that new infections are rising. We see new infections rising in Latin America. We see new infections rising highest in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Actually, the region where new infections are dropping, and dropping fast, is Eastern Southern Africa. And it's also the region with the highest number of HIV, of people living with HIV. So when we look at the total picture, we see new infections coming down, and that's great. But when you look per region, you see some regions not doing well.
Ms. Winnie Byanyima, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, too, for having me.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. And a reminder that we will be bringing you more big interviews on The Heat as we continue our coverage of this year's UN General Assembly.